What's up, everyone? Today we're going to be battling with some mono black zombies. I made some changes to my Pro Tour deck, kind of updated it. I felt the sideboard was a little weak for the tournament. Obviously, it didn't hinder me too much, but there are always improvements that can be made and whatnot. And I changed the mana base a little bit. I do think that I nailed the main deck, basically, as far as like the spells are concerned, but Westvale Abbey did not do a whole lot for me during the tournament, and it did kind of screw me on a couple occasions as far as like having enough black mana available for things like Relentless Dead and Grasp of Darkness and whatnot. So I'm going to try it without the Abbeys. It's possible that you could play like a Cradle of the Accursed or like, you know, one colorless land, but I'm going to try it pretty hardcore in the other direction and see where that gets us. So my main changes for this deck from the Magic Online list were basically to move a little bit away from Fatal Push, just because it was like pretty bad in the mirror, pretty bad against Marvel. And while you do want some against like Heart of Kirin against Mardu, I feel like Grasp of Darkness was overall just like a stronger choice, just because it also answered their 5-mana threats in Avacyn and Glorybringer. So moving kind of away from Fatal Push a little bit, I think helped me a decent amount, because most of my cards were live. It wasn't like you would have 2 Fatal Pushes, you would have a good target, and then you have just kind of this pseudo-dead Fatal Push sitting in your hand. So ideally, the deck could just play the 4 Fatal Pushes and have it be great, because 1 mana removal is certainly much better than having 2 mana removal, but Fatal Push is just like a little bit weak right now. So only played 2 and didn't even sideboard any additional copies. So yeah, Grasp of Darkness is great. In order to make room for the Grasp, I went a little bit lower on Liliana's Mastery. I do think this card is really good, really powerful, and I was certainly fortunate enough to draw it in the spots where it would actually be good. You know, just like, for a mid-game threat, you can't ask for much more than like 5 mana, make 2 3/3s, and pump the rest of your team. So Liliana's Mastery is definitely quite good. It is just a little clunky, a little unwieldy. So there are certainly some considerations of like, you know, do you want 24 land when you don't have as many 5-drop like powerful cards in your deck? Like maybe once you start flooding out, you start drawing some of the cards that are on the weaker end, like the Metallic Mimics. But mostly it wasn't an issue for me, because the deck has a lot of good ways to actually use its mana. So I think 3 Masteries is probably right. That could certainly change going forward, but that was basically it. Just tinkering with the Masteries, the Grasps, and the Fatal Pushes, like those numbers. Everything else is kind of set in stone. I think people thought that Metallic Mimic was a little on the weekend, but I didn't really. I thought it was like pretty good. Most of the time the deck is just trying to make like a pretty big board, and Metallic Mimic certainly helps with that. It's a little weak to things like Manglehorn, and it only has 1 toughness, so there's considerations to fighting Liliana the Last Hope in the mirror and all that stuff, but I do think that Metallic Mimic is very good for its purpose. You know, it does fit that purpose and do that role pretty well. So main deck, I do think I nailed. As for the sideboard, we went back and forth a lot on like how many Transgresses and Lost Legacies and Dispossesses and things like that. I was a little bit worried about like New Perspectives, just because I knew it was a pretty bad matchup, and I knew that there were going to be some people that played it, and I thought that with things like Liliana's Mastery, Diregraph Colossus, Crypt Breaker, like all these good ways to gain card advantage, you could actually beat an active Aetherworks Marvel as long as they weren't Ulamoging you. And for the most part, that's kind of true, but once you start running into the lists that have Chandra Flamecaller in them, that just becomes not true. So there's also the consideration of like whatever Lost Legacy Dispossessed card you play. It's like you're taking a turn off of developing your board to disrupt your opponent a little bit, and that certainly comes with a pretty big cost. It's not like you cast Lost Legacy or Dispossess and you definitely win the game. If that were the case, I would just play a lot of them, you know, but that's not how the games actually play out. Like the Marvel decks are set up to grind you with like Tireless Tracker and Whirler Virtuoso and stuff, so a lot of the time you're just better off building a board, hope their first Marvel doesn't serve up an Ulamog, and just go from there. So I am running the max amount of Transgresses. I'm not playing any Lost Legacies or Dispossesses, and I stopped boarding that card in, the Lost Legacies that I did have, against the Marvel decks towards the later rounds of the tournament. So I feel like it is probably correct to just not play any of them just because of how well their decks are set up to fight it. So we just have Transgress instead, and I think that's a reasonable enough concession, and this gives you like some way to disrupt your opponent while hopefully also building your board on turn 4. Another card on the sideboard, Fourth Grasp of Darkness. I think that this is pretty easy. Like, there are some green-black decks out there, some mirror matches, some Mardus. Like, you're going to want some extra removal against some of those matchups. 3 Liliana the Last Hope. These are pretty good in the mirror match because of Cryptbreaker and Metallic Mimic. Obviously, I think now that everyone has Liliana, I think that people might move away from keeping Mimic in the post-board games. And if they're playing black-white zombies, then Liliana is a little bit weaker because they don't have access to Mimic, and the removal is typically like Anguish Unmaking and Declaration in Stones. There's no guarantee that you actually get back the creature that you want. So I think the Liliana is still good. It's possible that I shave a copy in the future, but I want to play with the full 3 right now and see how it goes. My plan against Blue-Red Control in the tournament was Gonti plus Liliana the Last Hope, and since Blue-Red Control basically like didn't really show up and didn't do very well, I don't think you need the Gontis anymore. So Liliana without Gonti is a little bit weaker. It is this thing that can like actually threaten an ultimate against them, so it is still pretty powerful, and like maybe I'll board in 2 copies or something, but mostly I don't really have a plan for Blue-Red Control currently. Liliana's Mastery is pretty good against like Black-Green Delirium, if that's a deck. I do think that deck is reasonable as long as they have a plan for Marvel, and that deck could certainly pop up now that the metagame is established and they know how they're supposed to build their decks and whatnot. So there are also some mirror match situations where I might board this in. Like, if they're boarding into a more controlling package, it's possible that you cut like Lord of the Accursed Metallic Mimic and you board in like Mastery Liliana, Never to Return, stuff like that, and just have like a lot of really powerful sticky threats. And yeah, basically like any matchup that is going to go long, I think that Mastery is pretty reasonable. Sky Sovereign was a card that we considered for the Pro Tour but did not end up playing. It's kind of good in the mirror in that it doesn't die to any of the removal and it takes out like the Lords and stuff, but it also doesn't really fit the plan of the deck, which is to just build a big battlefield, you know? Like, you really want to get like 2 Lords, and if they have 2 Lords, then you want to get a 3rd Lord, you know? Like, you're just trying to like notch them, basically. And Sky Sovereign can help with that to some degree, where it can actually like take out a Lord and like put you back on the advantage, whereas before maybe you were on parity. So it was a card I didn't really get to try very much, so I definitely want to try the one here. There are also some decks with Planeswalkers, like, you know, any sort of like Marvel deck post board that is trying to beat you with like Chandras and Tireless Trackers and stuff. Sky Sovereign might end up being pretty good against, so I want to try that here too. Scrap Heap Scrounger was also mainly for Blue-Red Control, but I feel like is a fine card to just have in your sideboard because it's a recursive threat, and there are going to be some decks where Scrap Heap ends up being pretty good against if there's any deck that shows up to that tries to fight you with removal. So like any sort of control deck or Delirium deck or whatever. And then Never to Return is kind of my answer to Chandra Flamecaller, where like that card is going to show up a lot more, and before I did not have an answer to it, now I do. So Raptor played these in his deck, mostly as a concession to Liliana in the mirror match, which I think is perfectly reasonable and might be something that you need to take into account going forward. So I don't think that this is necessarily the best list of this deck going forward. I'm mostly just trying a bunch of things, but we're going to play 3 matches here in a league and hopefully be able to figure some stuff out.